My name is Meredith Clark. I am 42 years old, and nothing could have prepared me for the silence that filled that walnut-paneled room. The air was thick, stale, carrying the faint scent of old polish and paper. I sat with my hands pressed against an envelope, the paper already worn from my grip, my knuckles pale. Attorney Catherine adjusted her glasses and prepared to speak, her stack of documents resting on the table like a weight that could crush bones. Before she could begin, the door creaked open. The sound split through the stillness like glass shattering, and there they were. My father walked in first, his stride rehearsed, shoulders drawn back to project a confidence he had never truly owned. My mother followed, perfume heavy in the air, her smile almost theatrical. Their voices collided with the room's silence, light and casual, as if they had not vanished from my life 2 decades ago. "We are your guardians," my father said, his words hanging in the air with false authority. My mother's lips curled into a smile that was both sweet and sharp. Guardians. The word rang hollow. They had abandoned me when I was 22, when the weight of their debts became heavier than their duty. And now they stood here, bold, eager, expecting welcome. My fingers tightened on the envelope, pressing the paper into the grain of the table. I kept my face calm because tears would only give them power. I had rehearsed this moment in countless ways, imagined screaming, imagined demanding explanations, even imagined collapsing from the ache of recognition. But the reality was different. When I looked at them, I felt only cold. Their smiles widened, waiting for me to falter, but then Catherine stepped forward. She carried a binder thick enough to swallow their illusions whole. She placed it on the table with a firm thud. That sound stole the color from their cheeks. My father's grin faltered. My mother's painted lips pressed together. They knew the sound of finality when they heard it. Catherine began, "We will confirm identities and proceed with the reading." My father raised his hands. "Formality is not necessary. We are her parents. We can guide her through this. She must be overwhelmed." His gaze slid toward the papers as though he could will them to bend in his favor. I pulled the envelope closer. "I am not overwhelmed," I said, my voice steady. My mother leaned forward, her voice dipped in syrup. "Darling, no one expects you to carry this weight alone. The estate is vast. The money requires careful hands. The house demands constant care. Let us help." Their act would have been convincing to a stranger, but I had lived through the truth. Their faces had always lit up not for me, but for what I could hand them. And today, they did not come for reconciliation. They came for what they thought they were owed. The truth was already written. My uncle, the only one who had stood by me when they disappeared, had left me everything. The sprawling house that smelled of pine in winter, the company he had built brick by brick, and $5 million in liquid assets. It was more than money. It was proof that someone had seen my worth when my parents had not. Catherine's voice carried through the room, naming me as sole heir, detailing the assets, reading each line with deliberate precision. My parents leaned forward, desperate, as though closeness to the page could alter the ink. My father gave a hollow laugh. "That is quite a responsibility for someone still so young. Fortunately, as her guardians, we are ready to manage it for her." The absurdity of the word clanged against my ears. Guardians. These were the same people who drained my paychecks, who left me with nothing but overdue bills and locked doors. I looked them straight in the eye. "Please continue," I told Catherine. My mother's voice wavered. "Meredith, think about what family really means. This wealth, this home, it was built for all of us." But I could see it in her hands, trembling as they reached for the binder. They were not here for me. They were here for numbers, for deeds, for property. Their return was not a miracle. It was a transaction they hoped to hijack. The room pressed in on me. Yet, for the first time in 20 years, I felt the balance shift. I was no longer the daughter handing over envelopes across a kitchen table. I was the heir, and the ledger was about to be rewritten. To understand why I sat in that room with the past clawing at my throat, you need to know where I came from. I grew up in a modest house in Ohio. On the surface, we looked like any middle-class family, but beneath the siding and the flower beds, there was rot. My father lived for cards and dice, the kind of man who believed luck would save him from discipline. The smell of smoke followed him everywhere, seeping into the curtains, the walls, even the fabric of my school clothes. My mother was quieter, but weakness can be as dangerous as violence. She enabled his every failure, folding excuses into every empty promise. When I was 16, I started working at a diner. My first paycheck should have bought me freedom, a chance to save for college, or at least buy shoes without holes. Instead, I placed the envelope in my father's hand because he demanded it. He slipped the bills into his pocket without a word of thanks, only the click of his lighter in the silence that followed. That sound became the soundtrack of my youth. Money earned, money lost, nothing left for me. The debts grew. Creditors called at night. I learned to distinguish the sound of a collector's voice before the first sentence was finished. I learned to hide the fear in mine when I answered. My mother would whisper, "He will change, he just needs time." But time only sharpened his hunger. By the time I was 22, I had nothing left to give. My savings were gone, my spirit threadbare. One night, I came home from my second job to find the house dark, the closets empty. They had left, no note, no explanation, only a pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. That was their farewell. For weeks, I lived with the sound of that emptiness. I worked, I survived, I kept breathing. Then, out of the blue, my Uncle Daniel appeared at my door. He was my father's older brother, a man who had long ago distanced himself from the chaos. His voice was steady, his presence solid. He did not ask what happened. He did not need to. He simply said, "You will stay with me now." Daniel's house smelled of pine wood and old books. He built a company that thrived because he believed in work, not luck. With him, I learned what stability felt like. I learned that money could be used to build, not destroy. He gave me a room, a chance to finish school, and later he handed me the tools to carve my own career in accounting. And yet, even with Daniel's support, a part of me carried the weight of abandonment. The smell of smoke, the echo of unpaid debts, the sound of my father's laugh when I handed over my wages. Those things never left. They hardened me, but they also gave me resolve. That is why, 20 years later, sitting in that conference room, I was ready. Ready to face the people who had once drained me dry. Ready to claim what Daniel had entrusted to me. Ready to meet their smiles with silence and their lies with truth. Because the story you are about to hear is not just about inheritance, it is about betrayal, survival, and the quiet kind of revenge that comes when the past underestimates the strength of the one it tried to break. I was 22 when my childhood ended for good. That night is etched into me with a clarity sharper than any photograph. I had just finished a long shift at the diner. My uniform still smelled faintly of fried food and burnt coffee, the kind of scent that clung to my skin no matter how many showers I took. My body was sore, but in those days, exhaustion was ordinary. What I didn't know was that by the time I stepped through the front door, my life as I knew it would collapse. The house greeted me with silence, a silence so thick it felt wrong. Usually, I would hear the low hum of the television or the scrape of a chair against the kitchen floor. That night, there was nothing. Just a faint buzz from the overhead light in the hallway, flickering in and out, as if even the electricity was reluctant to stay. I called out, "Mom? Dad?" My voice echoed, unanswered. The first thing I noticed was the emptiness. Cupboards gaped open, shelves bare, drawers were yanked out, clothes missing. The small collection of family photographs that had sat above the fireplace was gone, leaving pale outlines on the wall where the frames had hung for years. On the kitchen table lay a single piece of paper, the edges curled slightly, as if it had been left in a hurry. My hands shook as I picked it up. The message was short. written in my mother's rushed handwriting. "You'll be fine. Don't come looking for us." That was all. No explanation, no apology, no love, just 8 words that erased 22 years of my existence. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, filling the space with a rhythm that sounded more like a countdown. Each second seemed to hammer the truth into me. They were gone. They hadn't been taken. They hadn't been forced. They had chosen to leave. And they had left me behind as if I were nothing more than an afterthought. I stood there in the dim kitchen, the light bulb sputtering, shadows bending across the walls. My chest tightened, but no tears came. My throat burned, my stomach twisted, but I couldn't cry. Instead, I felt hollow. The silence of the house wrapped around me, pressing in, crushing me from all sides. I tried the phone. The line went dead with a dull click, no connection. I dialed again, pressing each button slower, hoping I had made a mistake. Nothing. Their numbers no longer existed. It was as if they had erased themselves from the world and taken with them any chance of reaching out. I wandered into their bedroom. The closet was empty, hangers swinging slightly as though someone had ripped clothes off in a rush. The drawers were pulled out, contents gone. On the nightstand, the faint circle of dust showed where a lamp had once stood. They had taken everything, down to the smallest details, but left me with the mess, with the hollow echo of abandonment. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, holding that note in my hand, reading it over and over until the words blurred. My mind tried to find loopholes. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe they had to leave for safety. Maybe I would wake up and discover it was all a dream. But deep down, I knew better. That night, the weight of reality sank into me. I was no longer just a daughter struggling to help her parents pay debts. I was a woman cut off, discarded, stripped of any illusion that family was a safety net. My innocence, fragile as it had been, shattered in that instant. I didn't scream, I didn't break things. I just sat in that dead quiet, listening to the tick of the clock and the faint hum of the dying light, the sounds of abandonment. When morning came, the sun streamed through the curtains, but it didn't bring warmth. It only illuminated the emptiness they had left behind. That was the day I stopped waiting for them to change. The day I stopped hoping for apologies that would never come. That was the day I understood. Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones capable of wounding you beyond repair. And yet, even in that brokenness, a seed was planted. A resolve I didn't recognize then but would carry with me for the rest of my life. That night was not just the end of my childhood, it was the beginning of the person I would become. Before that night of abandonment, there were years of smaller betrayals, a slow erosion of my trust that began when I was just 15. Looking back, I realized my parents had been preparing me for their departure long before they finally walked away. At 15, while my friends were picking out prom dresses or arguing about crushes, I was signing documents I barely understood. My father would shove papers across the table, his voice sharp, his finger tapping where I needed to place my name. "Just sign, Meredith, you're helping the family." His breath smelled of cigarettes, and his tone left no room for refusal. One of the first was a cosign for a car loan he claimed he needed to get to work. That car disappeared within months, repossessed when he missed every payment. The debt, however, stayed with me. I was too young to grasp the consequences, but the letters that arrived in my name, stamped with red warnings, became a constant reminder. By 17, the requests had escalated. My mother, with her trembling hands and soft voice, would sit beside me, whispering, "You're the only one who can save us, honey. Without you, we'll lose everything." Those words were heavy, soaked in guilt, designed to bind me tighter. I signed student loan applications, not for my education, but for their pockets. Thousands of dollars borrowed under my name, money I never touched, money I never saw. The irony was cruel. I was working 2 jobs at the time, scrubbing tables at the diner and stocking shelves at the grocery store, but I never had more than a few dollars for myself. My paychecks went directly into their hands. If I tried to keep even a little, my father's temper would flare. He would pound the table, veins rising in his neck, reminding me of the roof over my head. I learned quickly. Peace in the house had a price, and the price was everything I earned. My clothes showed it. While classmates strutted into school wearing new jeans and sneakers, I wore hand-me-downs so threadbare they nearly split at the seams. I became a quiet target for jokes, whispers that carried down hallways. They laughed at the patches on my backpack, at the worn soles of my shoes. I pretended not to care, but every word carved deeper into me. Still, the worst wounds weren't from classmates, they came from my parents. Each time I hesitated to sign another form, to hand over another paycheck, my father's eyes would narrow and my mother's lips would tremble. She would whisper that I was their last hope, that family meant sacrifice. And every time, I folded. Not out of love, but out of fear and obligation. By 19, my credit was wrecked. I hadn't even attended college, yet I was drowning in student debt. Collection agencies called daily, asking for payments on accounts I hadn't opened. My parents, meanwhile, acted as if it was all perfectly normal. They had normalized using me as their safety net, their financial lifeline. The weight of those years pressed down on me. I watched my future shrink under the weight of their decisions. Apartments refused to rent to me. Because of my credit score, I couldn't get a small loan for myself. Every door seemed locked, and the keys were buried in the piles of debt my parents had left me. And yet, even then, I kept hoping. I told myself they were struggling, that once they got back on their feet, things would change. That hope kept me obedient, kept me quiet, until the night it all collapsed. When they finally abandoned me at 22, it was brutal, but it wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of 7 years of slow, steady exploitation. Years in which I had been drained of money, of trust, of dignity. Years that had turned me from a child into a reluctant adult carrying burdens far too heavy for my shoulders. Looking back now, I see those years for what they were. Not just hardship, but preparation. A twisted kind of training that taught me resilience through pain, strength through exploitation. They thought they had broken me, but in truth, they had forged the steel I would need for the battles still to come. 3 days after the night my world collapsed, I was still drifting in a haze. My parents were gone, their note still lying on the table like a cruel echo. I had been walking aimlessly through the empty house, picking up objects, putting them down, trying to convince myself it was all a mistake. Food had no taste, and time blurred into a loop of silence. The electricity bill had already arrived, and the refrigerator hummed like a reminder that life would not pause just because I had been abandoned. I had almost stopped answering the phone when it rang that third evening. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. For reasons I can't explain, I picked up. A deep, steady voice spoke on the other end. "Meredith, it's Daniel, your mother's brother." At first, I couldn't process his words. I barely remembered him. He had been distant, a shadow at family gatherings, someone my parents never encouraged me to know. But there was no hesitation in his tone. I heard what happened. "Pack what you can. I'll be there in an hour." The call ended before I could even ask how he knew. I stood frozen, staring at the phone, unsure if it had really happened. Then, through the fog, his words pressed into me. "Pack what you can. Don't look back." When headlights swept across the cracked driveway, I peeked through the blinds. A sleek black car waited outside, so out of place in front of our decaying house that for a moment, I wondered if it belonged to someone else. Then the driver's side door opened, and a tall man in a tailored suit stepped out. His presence filled the air with a weight I hadn't felt in days. He didn't knock. He simply stood at the doorway, eyes steady, waiting. When I opened the door, I noticed how different he was from the people I had grown up with. His posture was sharp, his movements precise, his expression unreadable. He didn't waste time on comfort. "Get your things," he said firmly. "We're leaving." I wanted to ask where, but his voice allowed no space for questions. I scrambled to stuff clothes and a few books into a duffel bag, my hands shaking. I looked around one last time at the peeling wallpaper, the sagging couch, the ghosts of arguments that still seemed to linger in the air. I expected a flood of memories to paralyze me, but instead, there was only a dull emptiness. Daniel took the bag from me without a word, carried it to the car, and opened the door. The leather seats smelled faintly of cologne and polish, such a contrast to the smoke-stained fabric of my father's old vehicle that I felt as though I had crossed into another world. I sank into the seat, clutching the strap of my bag like a lifeline. As the car pulled away, I caught a final glimpse of the house through the rear window. Shadows stretched across the porch, the light flickered in the hallway, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw my younger self standing there, waiting. My throat tightened, but no tears came. Daniel's voice cut through my silence. "Don't look back. There's nothing there for you." His words struck me. They weren't gentle, but they held a strange kind of mercy. He wasn't offering sympathy. He was offering escape. That night, he became a bridge between who I had been and who I might still become. The drive was quiet. The city lights blurred past, and the hum of the engine filled the space where conversation might have been. Daniel didn't ask me how I felt, didn't press me for details. He kept his focus on the road, his face lit by the dashboard glow. At first, I mistook his silence for coldness, but the longer we drove, the more I understood. He wasn't ignoring me. He was giving me room to breathe. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "You've been carrying too much. It ends now." Something inside me shifted. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of relief. I didn't know where we were going or what would come next, but I knew I was no longer alone. Daniel's presence was stern, even intimidating, but it was also solid, reliable, and utterly unlike the fragile foundation I had grown up on. That night, he didn't just take me from a broken house. He pulled me from the wreckage of my past. His hand didn't offer warmth, but it offered strength. And sometimes, that is the only kind of rescue that matters. The first night in Daniel's mansion felt like stepping into another universe. Marble floors stretched beneath my feet. High ceilings echoed every sound, and polished glass reflected a life I had never known. For a girl who had fallen asleep in a creaking house where the wallpaper peeled, this place was overwhelming. I clutched my small duffel bag as though it could anchor me in the middle of so much wealth. Daniel wasted no time on introductions or tours. He showed me to a guest room with a heavy oak bed and crisp white sheets. "Breakfast at 7 sharp," he said before closing the door. That was all. His words landed like commands, not invitations. Yet, in that bluntness, I felt a strange stability. He wasn't trying to comfort me with promises he couldn't keep. He was simply setting the rules. The next morning, I learned those rules were not negotiable. At exactly 7, Daniel sat at the long dining table, already dressed in a dark suit. A neatly folded newspaper lay beside his plate, and a cup of coffee steamed in front of him. I stumbled in, half awake, expecting maybe a smile or a question about how I slept. Instead, he tapped the chair across from him. "Sit, eat, then read." The maid placed eggs and toast in front of me, but before I could take a bite, Daniel slid the business section of the newspaper toward me and, "Start here. Read aloud what matters." I fumbled with the words, uncertain why he cared about market trends when my life was still in pieces. But he corrected me when I skipped a number, made me reread headlines until I understood them, and forced me to summarize in my own words. By the end of breakfast, I realized this wasn't just a ritual. It was training. Days turned into weeks. The house ran on precision. Meals at set times, study sessions in the library, practice with spreadsheets and reports. Daniel never raised his voice, never asked how I felt, but his presence was constant. He was there in the morning when I tried to explain inflation, there in the evening when I stumbled through learning balance sheets. He was not nurturing in the way I had once craved, yet I knew he was investing something priceless. His time. At first, I hated the coldness. I longed for warmth, for an arm around my shoulders telling me I was safe. Instead, I got discipline, silence, and an endless stream of lessons. But slowly, I began to see the care hidden beneath the structure. He didn't pity me, and that was a gift. Then came the day I made my first real mistake. Daniel had arranged for me to intern at one of his smaller companies, mostly to observe. My task was simple: collect expense reports and hand them to the accountant. Somehow, I misplaced a folder containing receipts worth several $1,000s. When I realized, panic consumed me. My hands shook, and my throat tightened as if I were a child again, waiting for punishment. I replayed my father's voice in my head, shouting, blaming, tearing me down. I braced for Daniel to do the same. Instead, he called me into his office. The room was lined with dark bookshelves and smelled faintly of leather. I expected thunder, but his tone was steady. "You lost the file?" I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. My chest burned with shame. He opened a drawer, pulled out another folder, and placed it in front of me. "Read this. Rewrite the report from memory. Compare your draft to the original. Learn where you failed." Confused, I looked up. "You're not angry?" He leaned back, folding his arms. "Mistakes are capital. If you pay attention, they earn interest. If you ignore them, they bankrupt you." The words lodged inside me. For the first time, failure wasn't a death sentence. It was an investment. I spent the night reconstructing every receipt, checking every line. When I handed the corrected report back, Daniel didn't praise me, but he gave a small nod that carried more weight than any compliment I had ever received. That moment marked the beginning of my transformation. He wasn't teaching me numbers. He was teaching me resilience. He was training me to think critically, to face problems without flinching, to build a life not on fragile emotions, but on strategy and discipline. I still ached for kindness, but what he offered was something better. He gave me the tools to fight, not with fists or tears, but with reason and control. Living with Daniel was never easy, but in those rigid routines and unspoken lessons, I began to rebuild the strength my parents had stripped away. When Daniel enrolled me in a private school, I felt like an intruder walking into a world that was not meant for me. The campus looked more like a miniature university than a high school. Manicured lawns stretched between brick buildings, and students strolled by in pressed uniforms, carrying expensive laptops and designer backpacks. I clutched my secondhand books, painfully aware that my shoes were scuffed, my clothes plain, and my accent betrayed a life without privilege. From the first week, I was marked as different. Some classmates whispered about my background. Others smirked when they saw me wearing the same sweater more than once. Their laughter echoed in hallways, subtle but sharp. I learned quickly to keep my head down. Yet, inside, something simmered. I was no stranger to humiliation, but I refused to let their taunts define me. Daniel never spoke directly about the ridicule, but he prepared me for it in his own way. After school, he would seat me at the long oak table in his study. Financial newspapers lay open, contracts stacked neatly beside them. He made me read line after line until I understood not just the words, but the logic behind them. "Observe the language," he said. "Every deal is a conversation. Numbers matter, but tone can shift outcomes." At first, I struggled. I stumbled over terms like liquid assets and leveraged buyout. My head swam with jargon that felt as foreign as my classmates' polished manners, but repetition carved grooves into my memory. Slowly, concepts clicked. I began to see patterns, not only in the texts Daniel handed me, but in the way people around me behaved. In classrooms, while others boasted about vacations and gadgets, I listened. My memory retained details: who bragged the loudest, who exaggerated their achievements, who downplayed weaknesses. What had once made me feel inferior became my hidden advantage. I could connect dots others ignored, predict outcomes before they unfolded. The turning point came during a debate club session. I had joined reluctantly, urged by a teacher who noticed my ability to analyze arguments. My opponent was a senior known for her sharp tongue and confidence. She opened with polished rhetoric, clearly expecting to crush me. But I drew on Daniel's lessons, framing my point strategically, anticipating her counters. When she faltered, I pressed, not with arrogance, but with calm precision. By the end, the room was silent. The applause that followed stunned me. For the first time, I realized intelligence could be armor. Daniel acknowledged my progress not with praise, but with opportunity. He began inviting me to accompany him to meetings. I remember the first vividly. The conference room was vast, the air heavy with the scent of leather chairs and ink from freshly printed contracts. Men in tailored suits spoke in clipped sentences, their pens tapping as they waited for signatures. I sat quietly beside Daniel, hands folded, eyes fixed on the documents before us. The rhythm of the room fascinated me. The scrape of chairs, the deliberate pause before a signature, the almost imperceptible glance exchanged between negotiators. Daniel leaned close and whispered, "Listen to the silence." That's where power lives. I absorbed everything, the cadence of voices, the weight behind a nod, the subtle shifts in posture. Each meeting became a masterclass. Back at home, Daniel quizzed me. What was the real offer? Where was the bluff? Who walked away with more than they admitted? At first, my answers were clumsy, but over time, I sharpened. I began to anticipate moves, to recognize when someone was cornered or when they held hidden leverage. Meanwhile, at school, the whispers and laughter gradually lost their sting. My grades climbed, my reputation shifted. Teachers admired my diligence, some classmates sought my help, and even those who once mocked me started to keep a cautious distance. I wasn't seeking their approval anymore. I was building something larger, a foundation for a life they couldn't imagine. Still, there were nights I sat by my window, staring out at the city lights, feeling the ache of loneliness. Daniel's mansion was full of order, but devoid of tenderness. His guidance shaped me, but the price was solitude. I craved warmth, yet I knew his version of care was the only one I could rely on. Looking back, those years were a crucible. The ridicule, the endless lessons, the exposure to high-stakes negotiations, all of it forged me into someone different from the frightened girl my parents abandoned. Step by step, I was learning not only how to survive, but how to wield knowledge as power. I didn't realize it yet, but Daniel was molding me for battles I had not even imagined. By the time I turned 18, my world felt steadier. I had endured years of ridicule, outgrown the sting of whispers, and built a fragile but growing confidence under Daniel's relentless instruction. Yet nothing prepared me for the battle that erupted. When it came time to choose a university, I longed for something simple. My friends were applying to schools close to home, places where weekends meant coffee shops we already knew, familiar streets, and comfort in shared memories. I wanted the same: normalcy, belonging, a chance to finally feel like part of a community instead of an outsider. I sat across from Daniel one evening, trying to explain this to him. "I just want to study near the people I know," I said, my voice steady but pleading. "It doesn't have to be the most prestigious school. I want to breathe, to live a little like everyone else." Daniel's expression hardened. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. The lamplight carved shadows across his face. "You think this is about convenience, about comfort?" His tone cut like glass. "You will attend the university I've chosen. End of discussion." Heat rose in my chest. Years of unspoken frustration boiled over. "I'm not your project, Daniel. You don't get to script every detail of my life." For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then he leaned forward, eyes burning. "And I don't intend to waste years raising another failure. If you want mediocrity, you'll get it without my help. But not under this roof." The words struck like a slap. My throat tightened, anger tangled with the ache of rejection. I wanted to shout, to throw back every rule, every demand he had pressed upon me. Instead, I clenched my fists and stared at the floor, shaking with rage. The quiet that followed was worse than the shouting. His breathing slowed, his gaze dropped for the first time. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, raw in a way I had never heard before. "You think I enjoy this?" he asked. "Do you imagine I wake up eager to dictate your every step?" "No, Meredith, I am hard on you because I know the cost of wasted chances." I frowned, confused, but he pressed on. "When I was your age, I had an offer. A scholarship that could have changed everything, but your mother and father convinced me to give it up. They said family mattered more, that we should keep opportunities within reach, and like a fool, I listened. I sacrificed for them, and in return, they gambled away everything. My future went up in smoke because of their weakness. The room tilted, his confession sinking in like a stone. I had never heard him speak of his past in detail, never seen him peel back the layers of stoicism. For the first time, I glimpsed the scar beneath his armor. His hands trembled slightly as he poured a glass of water. Do you see now? I will not watch you repeat my mistake. I will not let their failures become your inheritance. If I must be the villain in your eyes to keep you from becoming a casualty, then so be it. I wanted to argue, to insist that my life should be my own, but something in his tone silenced me. He wasn't just controlling me. He was wrestling. Ghosts that refused to die. His harshness wasn't born of cruelty alone. It was survival, forged from betrayal. The anger inside me softened, replaced by a reluctant understanding. I still hated his methods, still longed for freedom, but I could not ignore the truth in his words. He had been betrayed by the same people who abandoned me. His fight to steer my path was, in its own twisted way, an act of protection. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling. My resentment lingered, but beneath it pulsed something else, the realization that his scars shaped my own journey. Daniel's pain had become my compass, whether I liked it or not. The clash did not end our disagreements, but it marked a turning point. I no longer saw him only as the rigid man who demanded obedience. He was also a wounded brother, a survivor of choices stolen by the very people who once called themselves my parents. And though I still dreamed of charting my own course, I began to see the value in his relentless push. He wasn't merely trying to control me. He was forcing me toward a future stronger than either of us had known. The oak-paneled room smelled of polished wood and faint tobacco, the kind that lingered long after the man who once owned it had gone. I sat stiff in the high-backed chair, palms pressed against the sealed envelope that had brought us here. Every tick of the grandfather clock behind me made my pulse echo louder. The people surrounding me were not a family reunited. They were strangers bound by blood and betrayal. At the head of the table, Catherine, Daniel's trusted attorney, arranged the heavy file. Her steady movements contrasted with the tension crackling in the air. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes calm but sharp, as though she knew the storm about to unfold. My parents, who had slithered back into my life after 2 decades of silence, sat across from me. Their faces were rehearsed, smiles stretched too wide, eyes glittering with hunger rather than affection. When Catherine cleared her throat, the room hushed. She read Daniel's last words with measured precision, her voice carrying both authority and finality. To my niece, Meredith Clark, I leave the totality of my estate. This includes $5 million in assets and controlling ownership of Clark Realty. For a heartbeat, the silence was absolute. Then my mother's lips curled upward, her hand clutching my father's arm. My father, puffing himself with false confidence, leaned forward and said with forced warmth, "Sweetheart, that is an enormous responsibility. You are still young. Let us manage it for you. We know what's best." Their tone was drenched in feigned concern, but I caught the gleam in their eyes. They had not returned for reconciliation, nor to mourn Daniel. They had come only for what they believed was theirs by right of neglect. My stomach churned, yet I stayed silent. Years of practice under Daniel's watch had taught me the strength of patience, of choosing the moment rather than reacting in haste. Catherine did not share my restraint. She closed the folder with a crisp snap and looked directly at them. Her voice sharpened, cutting through their performance like a blade. "Perhaps you have forgotten, but Meredith is not your dependent. She ceased being your ward years ago. In fact, Daniel adopted her legally when she was 25. She is his rightful daughter under the law in every sense." The words landed with devastating clarity. My mother's painted smile cracked, slipping into disbelief. My father's jaw dropped, color draining from his face. Their posture faltered, shoulders collapsing under the weight of truth they had not anticipated. I studied them quietly, remembering nights of hunger when my paycheck disappeared into my father's pockets, remembering the echo of silence after they left me behind with nothing but a note. In that moment, I felt no urge to scream or gloat. I only felt an icy calm, as though justice itself had stepped into the room. My mother stammered, "Adopted? That cannot be. Daniel would never." But her words withered against Catherine's unwavering gaze. The attorney slid a notarized document across the table, its seal glinting under the chandelier. "Here's the decree. Signed and binding, Daniel ensured Meredith's security long before this day." The room tilted slightly, though not from shock. It was from release. For years, I had braced myself for the day my parents might reappear. I had rehearsed what I would say, imagined the confrontation in countless variations. Yet nothing I envisioned compared to this, Catherine delivering the blow with legal precision, stripping them of every pretense. My father slumped back, muttering curses under his breath. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though not a tear fell. Their act was unraveling, thread by thread. What they had expected to be their victory had turned into their undoing. I inhaled slowly, grounding myself in the reality Daniel had secured for me. His stern guidance, his uncompromising lessons, all had led to this moment. The empire he left behind was not merely wealth, it was a shield, forged to protect me from the very people who had once abandoned me. Still, beneath the triumph, a shadow stirred. They were not leaving quietly. I could see it in the twitch of my father's jaw, in the calculation sparking anew in my mother's narrowed eyes. This battle was only beginning, but for now, with Catherine's declaration hanging in the air, the balance of power had shifted. I straightened in my chair, finally meeting their eyes. My silence had spoken louder than any words. I was no longer the daughter they could manipulate, no longer the frightened girl left behind. I was Daniel's heir, his daughter by choice and by law, and the empire was mine to guard. The lawyer's words still echoed in my ears when I agreed to meet them. Perhaps it was foolish, perhaps I wanted closure. Either way, I found myself stepping into a dimly lit restaurant 2 nights later. The air smelled of garlic and wine, the kind of place designed to soften hard conversations. I chose a corner booth, my back to the wall, a habit Daniel had drilled into me. My parents were already there. My mother wore a faded dress, her lipstick smudged at the edges. My father had traded his old arrogance for a suit that fit poorly, shoulders sagging as though it carried more than fabric. They rose awkwardly, forcing smiles that felt brittle. "Meredith," my mother whispered, reaching across the table. I hesitated, then placed my hand briefly in hers. Her skin felt thinner than I remembered, her fingers trembling. My father cleared his throat, forcing a cheerfulness that rang hollow. "You look successful." I sat down, folding my napkin deliberately, giving them space to begin. For a while, no one spoke. Only the clinking of glasses from nearby tables filled the silence. Then my mother started. "We never should have left you. I think of you every night. It broke my heart." Her voice cracked, and she dabbed her eyes with a tissue. My father nodded gravely. "Life punished us, Meredith. I lost work. Debts piled up. Your mother's health has been failing. We were too proud to reach out, too ashamed. We abandoned you, and we regret it every day." The words, carefully woven, tugged at some old scar deep within me. A part of me wanted to believe them, to let the little girl inside finally hear the apology she had begged for. My chest tightened as I listened, but I kept my face calm. The waiter arrived with water, breaking the spell. After he left, the conversation shifted. My father leaned in, lowering his voice. "We're drowning. The house will be taken soon. The hospital bills keep growing. If we could just have a little help, $100,000 would save everything." The words hung heavy in the air. My mother squeezed my hand, tears brimming. "It's not charity, sweetheart. It's family. Just enough to clear the debt and cover my treatment. Then we can rebuild. Together." I sipped my water slowly, letting the silence stretch. Their eyes searched mine for sympathy, for the obedient daughter they thought still existed. Instead, I heard Daniel's voice in my memory. Patience is power. Listen first. Speak when it matters. Finally, I leaned forward, my voice quiet but steady. If Uncle Daniel had died penniless, would you be sitting here tonight? The question sliced through their performance. My father flinched. My mother's lips parted, but no words came. The clatter of silverware at a nearby table filled the void as they struggled to answer. I studied their faces, searching for sincerity beneath the layers of desperation. My father shifted in his seat, jaw tightening, eyes darting to the side. My mother whispered, "We would have come anyway. You're our daughter." Yet, even as she said it, her gaze flicked toward my handbag, as if measuring what it might hold. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of truth neither wanted to admit. I thought of the night I came home to an empty house, of the note left on the table telling me not to look for them. I remembered the years of being forced to sign loans, of watching my wages vanish. Those memories stood like sentinels around me, guarding me against the tears now glistening across the booth. I pushed my chair back slightly, not leaving, not agreeing, simply reclaiming space. You speak of regret, of illness, of debt, but what you really want is money, and money cannot rewrite history. My father opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to beg, but my expression stopped him. My mother lowered her head, her sobs soft and uneven. The dinner ended with no promises, no checks written, no reconciliation sealed. I paid the bill, leaving them sitting in the booth, staring into their untouched meals. Walking out into the cool night air, I felt both lighter and heavier at once. I had given them a chance to speak, to show if their return was more than greed. Their answer had been written not in their words, but in the silence after my question. The child in me still longed for parents, but the woman I had become knew better. The battle was far from over, yet in that moment, I understood Daniel's lesson in full. Compassion is strength, but clarity is survival. The night after the dinner, I could not sleep. My parents' tears replayed in my mind, their voices begging, their eyes brimming with desperation. For a moment, I almost convinced myself they meant it. But then Catherine called the following morning. Her voice carried the weight of something prepared long ago. "Meredith," she said, "Daniel left something for you. Come by my office." I arrived that afternoon. Catherine's office was lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes and the faint scent of ink and paper. She gestured for me to sit, then opened a drawer. From it, she pulled a sealed envelope, heavy with age. "Your uncle instructed me to give you this once the will had been read, and only when you seemed strong enough to handle it." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a folder, its edges worn, the paper inside yellowed. At the very top lay a contract, stamped and signed. The ink had bled faintly over time, leaving a blue haze around the words. Catherine watched me closely as I lifted the document. The heading read, "Transfer of Guardianship Rights." My eyes blurred, my breath caught. Below, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, was his signature. Next to it, a sum written in plain numbers, $30,000. The agreement stated in unflinching legal language that he had relinquished guardianship of me for that amount. My heart thudded violently as though trying to break free from my chest. I forced my gaze to the bottom of the page. There was my mother's name, too. Her handwriting looked hesitant, but it was there. Together they had signed away their rights. Together they had traded me for cash. I dropped the paper onto the desk as if it burned. My vision narrowed, spots dancing at the edges. "They sold me," I whispered. The words sounded foreign, as though someone else spoke them. Catherine leaned forward, her voice calm but steady. "Daniel discovered this years ago. He fought to keep you safe, but he wanted you to know the truth when the time came." I shook my head slowly, staring at the contract as if denial could erase it. Memories surged, my father pounding the table, demanding my paycheck, my mother whispering apologies while signing another loan in my name. Every betrayal, every dismissal, now connected by one root. I had never been their daughter in their eyes. I had been a transaction. The ink marks blurred again as tears filled my eyes. The numbers on the page mocked me. $30,000, a price tag smaller than the tuition at the school Daniel later sent me to. Was that all I had been worth to them? A sum that vanished into gambling debts and fleeting indulgence? My fingers traced the smudged ink, the letters bleeding outward like veins under the skin. The contract smelled faintly of mildew and old tobacco. I imagined my father sliding the paper across a table, taking the money without hesitation. My mother lowering her head, convincing herself it was survival, not betrayal. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. Rage and sorrow twisted inside me, colliding until I felt hollow. For years I had carried the wound of abandonment. But this was a scar carved deeper. They hadn't just left. They had sold me, weighed me on a scale, and decided $30,000 outweighed their child. Catherine gave me space, letting the silence breathe. Finally, she said, "Daniel knew you would need this moment. Painful as it is, clarity gives strength. You are free from illusions now." I wiped my face, though the tears kept coming. I thought of that night at the restaurant, their stories of illness and debt. I had felt pity, even considered forgiveness. But this document slammed the door shut. Their return had never been about family. It was about circling back to the investment they once discarded, hoping to profit again. I folded the contract carefully, though every crease felt like a cut. My voice was steadier when I spoke. They thought I was weak enough to fall for their act. Daniel knew better. He knew I needed proof, not words. Catherine nodded. He trusted you would stand taller when you saw the truth. I placed the file back into the envelope, pressing it flat with deliberate force. The girl who once begged for her parents' love was gone. What remained was a woman armed with evidence, no longer haunted by questions. As I walked out of the office, the weight in my chest shifted. It did not vanish, pain never does, but it hardened into resolve. My parents had written my value on a contract. Daniel had rewritten my worth in every lesson, every chance he gave me. Now it was my turn to decide how their betrayal would end. For the first time in years, my steps felt certain. 2 days after I uncovered the contract that sold me, I thought I had seen the worst. I believed no truth could wound deeper than realizing my parents had traded me for $30,000. But I was wrong. Catherine called again, her tone cautious. "Meredith, there is someone you need to meet. He came forward after hearing about the will. His name is Patrick." When I arrived at her office, a man in his late 50s stood by the window. His shoulders were slightly stooped, his suit worn at the cuffs, yet his eyes were sharp with unease. Catherine introduced us, and Patrick extended his hand. His grip was firm, but his expression carried guilt. "I used to work with your father," he began, lowering himself into a chair. "I was his business partner when he managed small construction contracts. I kept quiet for years, but Daniel once told me if the time came, I should speak." My pulse quickened. "Speak about what?" Patrick reached into a briefcase and placed a stack of documents on the table. I leaned forward as he spread them out. Bank forms, loan applications, credit slips. My name was scrawled across each one, written in a handwriting that imitated mine. "These accounts," Patrick said quietly, "were taken out in your name. Student loans, personal lines of credit. Your father used your social security number. He told the banks you co-signed everything. In truth, you were still a teenager." I felt the blood drain from my face. I lifted one paper, my supposed signature at the bottom. It looked eerily like mine, but carried the uneven pressure of forgery. My chest tightened, rage prickling under my skin. Patrick exhaled heavily. At first I thought he was desperate. He told me he'd repay once he caught a break. But it went on for years. Every time I confronted him, he laughed it off. He said, "Harm. She owes us. She eats our food. She lives under our roof. It's only fair." My hands shook as I traced the letters of my forged name. Not only had they abandoned me, not only had they sold guardianship, but they had continued exploiting me even after I left. My parents hadn't just disappeared. They had carried my identity like a credit card they could swipe whenever debt collectors circled. I swallowed hard. "Why are you telling me this now?" Patrick's eyes glistened. "Because Daniel asked me to. He knew your parents had crossed lines you could never imagine. He feared the truth would crush you before you were ready. He asked me to hold on to these documents until you had the strength to see them. When the news broke about the inheritance, I realized the time had come." Catherine slid the papers closer to me. "These will protect you, Meredith. If they try to claim anything, you have evidence your parents used your name illegally. Courts will not ignore this." I pressed the bridge of my nose, trying to breathe evenly. The room tilted for a moment. The betrayal expanded, filling every corner of my chest until I thought it would split me apart. I remembered my mother's pleading voice at dinner, asking for money for medical bills. My father's insistence that they had suffered too. Lies. All of it. They had been bleeding me dry long before they vanished. Patrick leaned forward, his voice lower. "I'm sorry. I should have stopped him, but I was a coward. Daniel was the only one who tried to fight for you. He bought some of the debts quietly, just to keep your record clean. He never told you. He wanted you to rise without knowing how deep the mud truly was." Tears slipped down my cheeks, but they carried more fury than sorrow. My parents had not only abandoned me, they had chained me with invisible debts, feeding off my identity like parasites. And all the while, they wore the mask of victims, hoping sympathy would earn them another payout. I gathered the documents into a neat pile, my hands steadier now. "Thank you, Patrick. I needed to hear it from someone who saw it firsthand. They can no longer twist the story. The evidence speaks louder than their tears." As I walked out with the folder tucked beneath my arm, I felt both shattered and sharpened. The little girl who once begged for affection was gone. What remained was a woman who carried proof of every theft, every betrayal, every lie. And I knew one thing with absolute clarity. My parents would never hold power over me again. The night was heavy with a restless wind that rattled the tall windows of Daniel's mansion, my mansion now. I had grown used to the quiet echo of marble floors and the slow hum of distant clocks, but that night, silence shattered when the gates creaked open. My parents had returned. They didn't wait to be announced. The front door swung wide, and there they were, framed in the golden light of the foyer. My father's jaw was set hard, my mother's eyes darting with desperation. They looked smaller than I remembered, not because their bodies had shrunk, but because their power over me had finally dissolved. "Meredith," my mother whispered, her voice trembling, "this is our last chance. Please, listen. We're drowning. The banks are coming. The hospital bills." Her words clattered into the air like broken glass. My father cut her off, stepping forward with sudden heat. "Enough begging! Daniel poisoned you against us. He took you from us, twisted your mind. He stole you." His fists clenched and the veins in his neck strained with rage. I stood at the foot of the staircase, gazing down at them. My pulse was steady. For the first time, I felt taller than both of them. "No," I said, my voice low but unshaken. "Daniel didn't steal me. You sold me before he ever came." The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's lips parted, then shut again, as if the truth lodged itself in his throat like a stone. My mother's eyes brimmed, but there was no innocence in them. Only fear of exposure, of consequences she could no longer outrun. He tried again, sputtering, "We did what we had to." "No," I interrupted, my words slicing clean. "You did what was easiest for you. You signed me away. You forged my name. You drained every ounce of dignity I had left. Don't stand here and tell me Daniel destroyed our family. You destroyed it yourselves." My father's face twisted with anger he could not contain. "You think money makes you righteous? You think that mansion, that inheritance wipes away what you are? You're nothing without us?" I took a single step down the stairs, meeting his glare. "Without you, I became everything." That moment burned into me like a scar. It was the closing of a circle, the child who once trembled in the dark, now facing the very figures who abandoned her. I expected them to crumble, to collapse into apologies. Instead, my father surged forward as though force might rewrite history. But the echo of his boots on the marble floor was joined by another sound. Firm knocks against the door, then the swing of uniforms entering. Police officers stepped inside, authoritative and composed. Catherine appeared from behind them, her presence unshaken. She had filed for protective measures days ago, anticipating this very storm. "Mr. and Mrs. Clark," one officer said, his voice sharp, "you are under order to leave these premises immediately. Continued harassment will result in charges." My father spun, his fury unraveling into frantic protests. "She's our daughter. You can't take her from us." The officer's reply was firm. "According to legal records, you relinquished guardianship years ago. You have no claim here." The sight of handcuffs gleaming in the foyer light drained the last shadow of dominance from my father's face. My mother's sobs echoed faintly, but they were not for me. They were for themselves, for the empire of lies collapsing around them. I stood motionless as they were guided toward the door. My father threw one last glance at me, half venom, half plea, but I did not flinch. The door closed behind them with a weight that felt final, like a chapter sealing shut. I exhaled, my shoulders loosening. Justice had not thundered with dramatic violence. It had arrived quietly, methodically, carrying the strength of truth. And for the first time, I understood Daniel's lesson fully. Power was not loud. Power was the ability to stand unbroken when the past tried to reclaim you. That night, in the echo of their departure, I realized the mansion was no longer his house. It was mine. And so was the freedom they had once tried to sell away, when the police cars vanished beyond the gates and the mansion returned to its stillness. I found myself alone once more. The silence did not haunt me anymore. It felt like a companion. Yet there was an emptiness, a quiet ache that swelled beneath my ribs. I wandered into Daniel's study, the place where he spent countless hours dissecting contracts, teaching me discipline without ever calling it love. The scent of leather and ink lingered in the air. My eyes drifted toward the oak desk where Catherine had told me something remained. I opened the top drawer and discovered an envelope with my name written in Daniel's precise handwriting. My throat tightened as I slid a finger beneath the seal. Inside, a letter waited. The paper was crisp, the ink bold, as though he had written it knowing it would outlive him. "My Meredith," it began. I was never a man of tender words. I knew numbers better than feelings, strategies better than comfort. But I hope you know, in every decision I made, I tried to shield you. I don't know how to say, "I love you," but I do know how to guard what matters. You deserved safety. You deserved freedom. And now, at last, you have both? The letter blurred as tears welled in my eyes. He had never said those words in life, never softened his stern edges, yet here they were pressed into paper, his confession written in silence. I pressed the page against my chest and let the tears fall, not out of grief alone, but out of gratitude. Daniel had been my fortress, the anchor who believed in my strength even when I doubted myself. He never coddled, never soothed, but his protection had been love in its purest form. I sank into his chair, the leather cool against my skin. The house was vast and empty, yet it did not feel lonely. The ghosts of betrayal no longer haunted its corners. Instead, I felt Daniel's presence woven into the walls, steady and unyielding. The clock on the mantel ticked softly. Outside, the wind calmed, leaving only the distant hum of the city. In that stillness, I realized justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives like this, subtle, deliberate, undeniable. My parents had been forced to face the truth, not through violence, but through exposure. Their lies had been dismantled, and I no longer bore their weight. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. My reflection in the study's darkened window caught my eye. No longer the girl who once handed over her wages without thanks, no longer the young woman abandoned with a note on the table. I was Meredith Clark, survivor, heiress, fighter. A single tear traced down my cheek, yet I found myself smiling. Not the brittle smile of someone pretending to be fine, but a quiet curve born from release. The battle was over, and I had not only endured, I had prevailed. I whispered into the silence, as if Daniel could hear, "Thank you. I'm free." The mansion held its breath, then exhaled with me. And in that final moment, as the weight of years slipped from my shoulders, I understood that closure was not the crash of doors or the thunder of revenge. It was the simple truth that those who betrayed me could no longer touch me, and those who loved me had already given me everything I needed to stand tall. The house was silent, yet within that silence lived peace. Justice had come, and with it, freedom. 6 months passed, and the silence in Daniel's mansion no longer felt heavy. It felt purposeful. Each morning, I walked into the office he once commanded, and the echoes of his discipline were still there. Straight backs, clear voices, and the unspoken expectation to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. The company was no longer just about property or balance sheets. Under my direction, we shifted profits into something more enduring, a foundation for children caught in the same financial traps I had known. Kids whose parents had used their names for loans or drained their savings before they were old enough to speak. I met them in shelters, in schools, in hidden corners of the city where shame still silenced them. For each of them, I saw a mirror of myself at 15, scared, unheard, and convinced there was no exit. The fund gave them lawyers, mentors, and the one thing money alone could not buy, a chance to believe their story wasn't over. Catherine stood by me, steady as ever. She transitioned seamlessly from Daniel's right hand to mine. But she was more than counsel. She became a second spine when mine trembled. And Patrick, with his scars from dealings with my father, offered legal guidance to dismantle fraudulent webs that preyed on the vulnerable. Together they formed a circle I once thought impossible. Adults who stayed, adults who fought beside me rather than against me. I did not forgive my parents, not in the way people often crave a tidy ending. I could not hand them that comfort. But I did allow myself a different kind of mercy. I no longer carried their weight as proof of my inadequacy. I no longer measured myself by the love withheld from me. What they sold, abandoned, and betrayed was real, yet it no longer dictated who I became. The girl who once waited in a silent house for parents who never came back, she is still part of me, but she is no longer in charge. I've taken the steering wheel, and for the first time, the road ahead feels open, unclaimed, mine. One quiet Sunday, I returned to the cemetery with fresh lilies. The air was crisp, the sky untroubled, as if even the world conspired to give me stillness. Daniel's grave stood tall among marble markers, but it wasn't the size that drew me. It was the gravity of what he had done for me, a man who rarely spoke of love, yet lived it more fiercely than anyone I'd known. I traced the carved letters of his name, and below them I had arranged for one more word to be etched. Father. My voice trembled as I whispered, "You never needed to say it. You proved it." For the first time, the ache inside me felt lighter, as though stone had shifted off my chest. I realized then that justice does not always thunder with courtroom hammers. Sometimes it arrives in the undeniable stillness of truth revealed. My parents' faces, frozen in disbelief at the will reading, were proof enough. No revenge I could orchestrate would weigh as much as that single moment when their last excuse collapsed. Yet what lingered was not triumph, but clarity. The cycle ended with me. I would not become the kind of parent who used a child's life as collateral. I would not allow greed to masquerade as love in my lineage. My legacy would be built not on survival alone, but on transformation. Before we say goodbye, I want to turn this story outward. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock loudly on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.